And I wanted to mention, this is from some of our research. This is from a paper from last summer, and I wanted to mention that learning doesn't end once they start to breed, and here's evidence of that. So this particular one is brood size, and one there indicates the first year of a territory. So these birds are 5 years or older, so they establish a territory. And what you can see is quite an increase here in brood size here as these birds get older. So presumably these birds at year 10 would be 15 years old. And you can see that this pattern has not ended, right? It hasn't reached any kind of climax and then begun to decline. And so reproductive rate continues to increase at least as far as we've analyzed it. So they are learning. They're learning to be better breeders, better foragers, better defenders, and those sort of things. So these eagles have a long learning curve that keeps going with experience. And here's another indication of that. This is a proportion of territories of different age that have produced 3 chick broods, which is typically our maximum. So it takes an experienced pair to produce a 3 chick brood. It's a lot of effort that has to go in. They have to be good foragers and good providers. And you might know that the Botanical Gardens has been one of the champions in the Lower Bay of producing 3 chick broods. It takes a lot to be able to do that. And you can see here in the first year that 3 chick brood rate is less than 20%. Okay, less than 2%. It goes on up to 16% and keeps climbing. So these older pairs, like the Botanical Garden is likely an older pair that successfully produce 3 chick broods. It takes quite an experienced pair of adults to pull that off. And they're not that common in the population. Something about the size, the body size. So this is how we weigh eagles here. This bird's been mobilized. We'll put it on a scale here. And I just wanted to show you what some of the differences are here. You might know that in this particular species we have sexual size dimorphism where the females are larger, typically about 30% larger than the males. That's true for this population. Our particular population is about midway in body size between Florida and the extreme northeast of the range. And so there's a latitudinal gradient in body size. Ours is sort of about midway. The individuals down in Florida are quite small. Some of the males are very tiny. We call them pee-wees when they come up here into the bay. And they might be the size of red tails, very tiny birds. But our males here weigh about 7 to 8 pounds. The females are more like about 10 to 12 pounds. As you go further up in latitude, they might reach 14 pounds. So the Alaska birds are the largest ones within the range, and they can reach those kind of sizes. The females can't. So they are different in size. This is one of Dwayne. This is the Norfolk Botanical Garden pair. I have looked at tens of thousands of photos of eagles, and at least for my taste, this is one of the best photos I've ever seen. Because it shows the pair together. You have a good size comparison here. This is the male here in front. And it's not just a matter of differences in body weight. They're not equals. So if you see these flying, and you see a lot of individuals flying, you see that the proportions of their bodies are different. The males have a sleeker body, and their wings are thinner. And so the wing loading is quite a bit different if you see them flying. So it's not just a matter of, taking a Xerox machine and enlarging the male and you have a female. There are body proportional differences between the sexes, and you can see that here. You can see how thick the female's neck is here, and that continues on down. So there are differences in shape that, after a while of looking at these, you can pick up on. And one of the other characteristics that we use to sex the birds is foot size. This happens to be a 4th-year female, and this is a 3rd-year male. And look at the differences here in the feet. Females have considerably larger feet, and that's typically one of the best ways that we have to sex them. They're also different in wing cord and weight and other things. But when you look at the birds, the males have thin toes, and they have a smaller grasp. And I think you can maybe pick that up here in between. So there are differences between the sexes here. So just to recap some of that, they're determinate growers reaching adult size by fledging. Females are typically 30% larger. Males have sort of a sleeker body form. There's a plumage sequence that gets closer to the adult with each successive molt that we see through the years. The plumage pattern changes, and it's not just the plumage. The soft tissues and the hard tissues also change in color. And learning continues after reaching breeding age, and what we see is an elevation in breeding performance that goes on at least as far as we've recorded it. Maybe it goes on for 20 years. We don't know. All right? I wanted to say something about the annual cycle that we see here in the Chesapeake Bay, what we expect at different times. And I'll just go through a couple of things here. Nest building is something that we actually can see year-round here in the Chesapeake Bay. Our birds are resident year-round, which is different than some of the Florida birds that may migrate or birds from the Northeast that migrate at different times. Our birds typically do not migrate, and so they're on territory year-round. Nest building intensifies, though, here in the Chesapeake in about mid-October. We start to see more interest in the nest, more actual maintenance activity typically, and that peak sort of runs through about mid-February or so. Incubation typically runs in this period, mid-January through early May. Laying actually starts in the lower bay. For some of our pairs, some of our earliest pairs on the James River may lay December 15th or so. And so by the time we do our first aerial survey, those birds might have chicks that are 40 days, but they're way out ahead of the rest of the population. Between the James River and the Potomac River, there's about a 5-day difference. And so birds get later and later as we go north. And if we were to go down into North Carolina, they continue to get earlier. If we get down to Florida, Florida has a completely different breeding period where they're actually finished breeding typically by mid-May, early May, and that's when they migrate up to the Chesapeake Bay. So their breeding season is much, much earlier than ours. We typically have small young in this period here from early March. So most of our birds have laid by mid-February or so. Most of them start hatching sometime in the March period. It actually peaks somewhere here in April. We have large young in the nest, sometimes as late as early August, but most birds have fledged at that point. One of the periods that we know the least about is the post-fledgling dependence period. And we get a lot of questions about this. How long do the chicks stay on the natal territory? How long are they provided for by the adults? How long do they stick around? Do the adults chase them away? Those sorts of things. That is one of the reasons that we have been putting transmitters on chicks over the past several years. We've put out maybe 22 transmitters on chicks, and we're interested in resolving some of this. It turns out that it varies quite a bit. Some of these chicks leave the territory within a couple of weeks. Other ones may stay 3 or 4 months, at least from our tracking data, before they leave the territory. What causes the difference, we don't know. But it's quite a variable parameter for bald eagles. Peregrine falcons, quite different. Peregrine falcons, when they hit 50 days, they're gone. The bald eagles seem to be more variable than that, and we're interested in some of the reasons for that. All right, something about some of the nests and so forth. This happens to be a nest up at Quantico Marine Base, and you can see the typical structure here. The nest is comprised of a large base, which is made out of large materials, typically 1 to 2 inches in diameter, quite large materials. Then it's built up with finer materials, and finally we get to the sort of inner part that we refer to as the cup or the egg cup, the egg bowl, yes. And it's typically with fine materials. And here you can see a clutch of 3 eggs. Typically here in the bay it's 1 to 3, rarely 4. Interestingly, if you look back into the 20s and the teens of the 1900s, there were a lot of clutches that were collected in the bay that were 4 or 5 eggs. There are a couple of 6-egg clutches. And we sort of wonder, what's the story with that? Were there multiple females involved? Was it one female that was producing those large clutches? We don't know. But they were documented. We have virtually never documented a 4-egg clutch. We've only had one 4-chick brood in all of the years that we have flown, literally tens of thousands of breeding attempts, and we've documented one 4-chick brood. That was on the James last year. There have been 2 other ones documented in the bay. One documented last year on the Pocomoke River in Maryland, and the other documented in the mid-80s further up in Maryland on Remington Farm. So they're rare. The other thing that we see with this particular nest is garnishing. And oftentimes we see this with raptors. There's many raptors that use garnishes. They'll typically take conifers. Here you can see some cedar material, but they often take loblolly pine boughs and they'll bring those to the nest. And you'll see them doing that repeatedly throughout the breeding period. And it's generally believed that these conifers or evergreens give off chemicals that are sort of insecticidal. in their quality. And so that's one of the reasons for the garnishing. This is what the egg size looks like. They're fairly large eggs, fairly meaty eggs, about the size of a baseball. So fairly large. They're about 90 grams or so. Incubation, this is a nest over on the eastern shore. Incubation typically lasts for about 35 days or so. And both sexes incubate, so they trade off. But typically the female has the night shift, and she'll be replaced by the male in the early morning, and then she'll go off to feed, and she'll usually come back late morning, and it'll go like that through the day. And I should say that the females rule the roost around the nest, right? So they're dominant to the male. But not only larger, they're dominant. And so when she wants to take over, either with incubation or brooding or something like that, she does. When the male brings in fish, she takes it. So she is completely dominant to the male, typically. And let's see if this will work here. So this is a short little piece of video. Let's see if it'll run. Yeah. So this is a hatching event. And hatching actually takes about 24 hours. It begins when the bird breaks through the air sac. So there's an air sac or a chamber within the egg. They'll typically break through that so that they can breed. And then they'll start rotating through to pip the shell in a circular manner, and eventually they will break through. This is a very traumatic period for chicks, and this is not just true for eagles, it's true of all birds, that a lot of chicks are lost at this stage. So it's a very dangerous stage because they can adhere to the shell, they can sometimes not get out of the shell. So it's a very sort of period when a lot of chicks are lost. So this is a chick shortly after hatching, and you can see that it has a white type of down we refer to as natal down. This is a wispy type of down. It doesn't provide a lot of insulating qualities. We see these from the air, and they start to lose this down when they're 10 days old. So we know how old they are when they have this. We refer to these as blondies. Because you can see them distinctly in the nest. Even though we're flying over at a reasonable altitude, when you see them, it's a real characteristic color for them. Here you can see the classic egg cup here. See how this fine vegetation has been formed into a cup, and that holds the eggs. But it also provides a tremendous amount of insulating properties. So the adults can actually sit on this and create a dead airspace, and they can heat that airspace, and it's insulated around. And so it serves a great purpose, not just to hold the young chicks and the eggs in place, but to provide some insulation there. These are a couple of chicks up on the parappa tank just off of the York there. These are about 15 days old. Notice that the natal down has been replaced with a new set of down, and this down is darker. It's actually thicker and has tremendous insulating qualities. It's like a down coat. And these birds can get overheated on a hot day because they're there in this coat, and it gets hot, and you'll see them panting in the nest often. One of the things that I want you to notice with these next couple of slides is how their posture changes. Chicks of this age typically sleep a lot, and they're always hunched over, so they're down on their elbows when they're standing. They're not able to get very linear or upright. Notice, too, how large their feet is. Eagle body parts grow at different rates, and so different body parts may grow early, the feet grow early. And so they reach their maximum foot size fairly early on, and then the rest of the body parts sort of grow after that. This is a chick that's about 30 days old, and you can see it's starting to get its contour feathers here. Notice it's a little bit more upright, and it has more gripping capability here. The feet are starting to look like they have some ability to grip. And notice the outer side of this nest here, what we refer to as corralling or railing. The adults will put these sticks around the edge, and it sort of keeps the chicks in there. Yeah. Let's see. This is a nest at Camp Harry, and these chicks here are in the early 40s. They're 40, 42 days old. Look at how much more upright they are. They seem to be much more alert. Their body proportions are actually changing. You can see a catfish head in there. Interesting for Ed is that these two chicks were recovered later as breeders and taken to the Wildlife Center. Both of them. You know, we banded both of these chicks, and both of them, a number of years apart, were taken to the Wildlife Center which is amazing really, because they were in the same nest. And it was several years until they were recovered. So, unusual situation there. This is a chick that's more like 50 days. You can see it's much more upright now. One of the other things that you'll notice is the feathering. These birds actually feather out when they're sort of in the mid-40s. And so all of the rest of that period, from the time that they're several weeks, let's say 6 to 8 weeks, until they're 12 weeks, they're mostly feathered out and they're mostly grown. And that last period there is really a period of control. They start to learn neural control and coordination, and they'll need that later. And so that later period of growth or development is mostly coordination development.
Hi, this is Dr. Watts. Do you mind if I record and post video from today on YouTube?
Yeah, that'd be fine.
Thank you.